history does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits for the world to grow quiet, for the confidence of an age to settle into routine, and only then does it begin to move. Not with urgency, not with spectacle, but with a small sense of unease that something has been arranged badly and left that way for too long. This story begins in such a moment when the 19th century felt certain of its progress and strangely tolerant of its suffering, and when change had not yet learned how to raise its voice. Before there was war, before there was a lamp carried through dark corridors, there was simply a woman noticing things that others had trained themselves not to see. Not catastrophes, not dramatic injustice, but the quiet failures that repeated every day without attracting attention. Rooms where air did not move. People left unattended because no one had been assigned the task of noticing them. Systems that continued not because they worked, but because they were familiar. Most people accepted this as the natural shape of things. A few felt uncomfortable. One person decided that discomfort was not enough. Wealth softened edges. Education was generous, travel was encouraged. The future prepared for her was calm and respectable, designed to absorb her energy without allowing it to disrupt anything important. Marriage, household management, social usefulness, all of it arranged like furniture that had already decided where it belonged. It was not an unkind design. It was simply complete. And completeness can be difficult to escape. What made Florence unsettling was not rebellion in the dramatic sense. She did not fight openly against her circumstances. She did not reject society with anger. She simply did not reshape herself to fit the role that had been prepared. From an early age, she paid attention in a way that felt excessive to those around her. She noticed patterns. She noticed repetition. She noticed how often suffering was treated as background noise rather than a problem to be solved. This attention was not sentimental. It was sustained, analytical, and quietly exhausting to anyone who tried to argue that nothing could be done. She believed she had been called to a purpose, though she experienced that belief less as comfort and more as obligation. To her, calling did not feel inspiring. It felt demanding. It suggested that work existed regardless of her preferences, and that refusing it would be a form of neglect. This made the people closest to her uneasy. A calling implied permanence. It implied that distraction would fail. Her family tried distraction anyway. Travel was offered, scenery, culture, distance, all in the hope that beauty would soften resolve. Instead, it clarified it. Away from England, Florence observed places where illness was not hidden behind politeness. Care was often harsh, sometimes inadequate, but direct. She began to understand that suffering was not evenly distributed. It followed conditions. It gathered where air was stale, where water was unclean, where responsibility was vague. This realization did not turn her toward outrage. It turned her toward method. If suffering followed patterns, then it could be studied. If it could be studied, it could be reduced. This was not how care was usually discussed. It was how Florence began to think about responsibility. At home, the idea that she might become a nurse was received with alarm. Nursing was not considered a profession. It was associated with disorder, low status, and moral suspicion. For a woman of Florence's position, choosing this path was not seen as admirable. It was seen as unnecessary and vaguely inappropriate. Florence listened carefully to these objections. Then she set them aside, not out of defiance, but because they did not address the problem she could already see. Her education became her quiet defense. Languages, mathematics, administration, these gave her tools to see systems rather than traditions. They allowed her to ask questions that sounded practical rather than emotional, and that made them harder to dismiss. Her father eventually chose to support her training, a decision made without drama that would later echo far beyond the family. It gave Florence access to environments where care was treated as disciplined labor rather than charitable instinct. There she learned something that would shape everything that followed. Kindness without structure exhausted itself. Care without order failed the people it intended to help. Cleanliness mattered, air mattered, routine mattered. None of this was heroic. That was precisely why it worked. Improvement arrived quietly, reducing harm without asking for recognition. Her early work reflected this understanding. She reorganized routines, enforced standards, and introduced changes that seemed small but carried weight. Reliable cleaning, accountability, simple order. She was not interested in appearing compassionate. She was interested in preventing damage that never needed to occur. By the time distant war began to enter public conversation, Florence already understood what war would reveal. Conflict did not create disorder. It exposed it. She did not seek the role history would later assign her. She prepared systems, gathered knowledge, and waited with a patience sharpened by certainty. When the moment came, it did not feel like destiny. It felt like inevitability. The lamp had not yet been lifted and the fire had not yet arrived, but the room was already dark, and someone had decided not to pretend otherwise. A comfortable life that refused to sit still. If the first tension in Florence Nightingale's life came from noticing what others ignored, the second came from being surrounded by comfort that expected gratitude in return. Comfort has a way of asking for silence. It offers safety, predictability, and approval, but only on the condition that it not be questioned too closely. Florence lived inside this bargain from the beginning. Her home was orderly, her education was generous, her future was imagined with care by people who believed they were protecting her from unnecessary difficulty. What they did not understand was that difficulty had already arrived, quietly, in the form of restlessness that refused to explain itself. Her days followed a pattern considered ideal for a young woman of her class. Study, social visits, family obligations, travel when appropriate. Nothing was missing. And yet Florence moved through these routines with a sense that they were misaligned, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. She did not reject learning. She absorbed it deeply. Languages came easily. Reading became a habit rather than an activity. Mathematics appealed to her not as abstraction, but as clarity. Numbers, she noticed, had no patience for excuses. They revealed whether something worked or it did not. This intellectual appetite made her difficult to place. She was too serious for frivolity, too focused for idleness, and too disciplined to be dismissed as merely eccentric. Those around her struggled to understand why someone so fortunate seemed persistently unsatisfied. Florence herself did not frame it as dissatisfaction. To her, it felt more like misallocation. Energy was being spent in the wrong places. Attention was being directed away from problems that did not disappear simply because they were inconvenient. Social life intensified this tension. Marriage was presented not as a choice, but as a resolution. Suitors appeared, well-chosen, respectable, entirely suitable by every standard except the one Florence could not ignore. Marriage, she sensed, would close something permanently. Not freedom in the dramatic sense, but capacity. The ability to respond fully to work that demanded uninterrupted attention. She did not romanticize sacrifice. She understood it as arithmetic. Something given to one obligation would be taken from another. Florence did not refuse marriage with bitterness. She evaluated it carefully as she evaluated everything and found that it would require her to divide herself in ways she was unwilling to do. This decision puzzled and frustrated her family. To them, marriage was stability. To Florence, it looked like containment. Not imprisonment, but compression. Her refusal was not loud. It was calm, consistent, and deeply unsettling to those who believed patience would eventually soften it. Travel was meant to solve this. Removed from familiar pressures, surrounded by culture and beauty, Florence was expected to relax into acceptance. Instead, distance stripped away the polite filters she had learned to tolerate. She saw illness treated without ceremony. She saw poverty addressed without illusion. Care, when it existed, was often blunt, sometimes harsh, but direct. The contrast sharpened her thinking. Back home, suffering was often hidden behind etiquette. Abroad, it was simply present. These observations did not make her sentimental. They made her analytical. Florence began to see that many of the comforts she enjoyed depended on systems that quietly failed others. Cleanliness, ventilation, reliable water. These were not universal. They were privileges distributed unevenly and defended by habit rather than logic. The more she noticed this, the harder it became to return to conversations that treated comfort as evidence of moral order. Her family interpreted this growing seriousness as strain. They worried that Florence was exhausting herself emotionally, that her attention to suffering was unhealthy. She listened to these concerns politely. Then she continued. To her, ignoring problems did not make them disappear. It only delayed their consequences. The idea that she should protect herself from discomfort felt strange when others had no such option. Education became her refuge and her weapon. She studied not to impress, but to understand. She read reports, histories, administrative manuals. She paid attention to how institutions described themselves and how they actually functioned. Patterns emerged. Responsibility was often diffuse. Failure was rarely owned. Suffering was framed as unfortunate rather than preventable. Florence did not argue against these narratives emotionally. She questioned them practically. Her father, watching this process unfold, recognized something unusual. Florence's seriousness was not defiance. It was capacity. He supported her learning even when it led her away from expectations he had once assumed were fixed. This support did not resolve tension within the family, but it made action possible. With access to structured training environments, Florence began to translate observation into method. In these early stages, she learned that care required restraint as much as empathy. Uncontrolled sympathy led to exhaustion. Improvised kindness led to inconsistency. What mattered was repeatability. Clean rooms stayed clean only if someone was responsible for them. Patience improved only if conditions did not undermine recovery. These insights did not feel revolutionary to Florence. They felt obvious. That others resisted them only confirmed how deeply habit had replaced thought. This growing clarity created distance between Florence and the life she was expected to lead. Social gatherings felt increasingly hollow. Conversations looped around topics that never touched consequence. She did not condemn these spaces. She simply stopped believing they were sufficient. Her restlessness was no longer internal. It had direction. She wanted to work where effort produced measurable change, not approval. The idea of nursing, once scandalous, now felt inevitable. Not as a role, but as a field where systems could be tested and improved. Florence did not imagine nursing as heroic service. She imagined it as organized labor, care delivered consistently under conditions that reduced harm rather than added to it. This framing unsettled nearly everyone she discussed it with. Nursing was meant to be instinctive, emotional, almost invisible. Florence proposed making it deliberate. Resistance intensified. Friends worried about reputation. Family members warned of exhaustion and disappointment. Florence listened, considered, and proceeded. She was not reckless. She prepared. She sought training where discipline mattered more than charity. She observed how small changes accumulated into large effects. Clean air reduced fever. Clean linens reduced infection. Quiet routines preserved strength. None of this attracted attention. That was precisely why it mattered. As Florence moved further from the life designed for her, she did not experience liberation as joy. She experienced it as responsibility. Comfort had taught her what was possible. Observation had taught her what was wrong. Education taught her how to intervene. The combination left her with no comfortable place to rest. Once systems became visible, they could not be unseen. Once failure revealed its patterns, indifference became a choice rather than an accident. By the time she committed fully to her path, Florence was no longer seeking purpose. She'd found it, and it was heavier than expected. The quiet life she left behind did not disappear. It remained as a reminder of what she had refused. Not happiness, but containment. The world beyond it was more difficult, less approving, and far less polite. It was also real. This was the tension she carried forward. A mind trained by comfort, applied to disorder. A discipline shaped by privilege, used to confront neglect. Florence did not yet know where this path would lead. She only knew that remaining still was no longer possible. The fire was still distant. The lamp was still unlit. But movement had begun, and it would not stop simply because the night preferred things to remain quiet. A calling that made everyone uncomfortable. Once Florence Nightingale accepted that remaining still was no longer possible, the question shifted quietly from whether she should move to how far she was willing to go. This was the moment when intention hardened into obligation, when curiosity became duty, and when the idea of a calling stopped being abstract and began to interfere with daily life. A calling, after all, is inconvenient by design. It does not ask whether the timing is good. It does not check whether the room is ready. It simply insists. Florence did not experience this insistence as inspiration. There was no rush of emotion, no dramatic certainty. It arrived instead as pressure, steady and persistent, like a hand placed gently on the back that refuses to lift. She believed that work had been placed before her, not as a reward or a passion, but as something required. To ignore it would be to participate in the very neglect she had begun to recognize everywhere else. This belief made her increasingly difficult to reassure. Comfort could not soothe it. Approval could not quiet it. Advice, however well-meaning, only circled the problem without touching it. Those closest to her felt this shift immediately. Conversations changed tone. What had once been dismissed as seriousness now felt immovable. Florence listened to concern without reacting defensively, which only deepened the unease. People expect resistance to announce itself loudly. Quiet certainty is far more unsettling. It leaves no obvious opening for compromise. Her family worried not only about reputation, but about the cost of such commitment. Florence understood these fears. She shared some of them. A calling did not promise happiness. It promised work. Long, repetitive, often unrecognized work. The romantic version of service held little appeal for her. She was not interested in self-sacrifice as performance. She was interested in outcomes. This distinction was difficult to explain in a culture that preferred intention to be visible and effort to be decorative. Religion played a role in this internal shift, but not in the way others expected. Florence did not lean on faith for comfort. She leaned on it for accountability. If there was a purpose to her life, then it demanded response. Belief was not reassurance, it was responsibility. This interpretation unsettled people who preferred religion to soften hardship rather than intensify obligation. Florence did not argue theology. She simply acted as if belief carried weight. As her resolve grew clearer, resistance became more direct. Nursing was raised again as an unacceptable choice. It was described as degrading, exhausting, and inappropriate. The moral risks were emphasized repeatedly, as if proximity to illness somehow compromised virtue. Florence listened carefully. Then she asked practical questions. Who then was responsible for the sick? Who ensured conditions did not worsen suffering? Who decided that certain lives were acceptable casualties of disorder? These questions rarely received satisfying answers. The idea that nursing might be professionalized rather than endured was deeply unsettling. Care, in the popular imagination, was meant to be instinctive, emotional, and temporary. Making it systematic suggested that neglect had been optional all along. Florence sensed this discomfort even when it was not articulated. It confirmed her suspicion that resistance was not about her suitability, but about what her suitability implied. She sought training environments that reflected her understanding of responsibility, places where discipline mattered, where care was treated as labor rather than charity. In these spaces, she encountered a version of service stripped of romance. Schedules were strict. Cleanliness was enforced. Emotional excess was discouraged. At first glance, this restraint appeared cold. Florence recognized it as sustainable. Care that exhausted its providers was not care. It was failure delayed. Here the concept of calling took on a new shape. It was no longer a personal conviction alone. It became a standard she expected others to meet. This shift created friction. Florence did not tolerate improvisation when routine would suffice. She did not excuse negligence simply because it was common. Her expectations were precise, and they made people uncomfortable, not because they were unreasonable, but because they revealed how low the existing standards had been. This period sharpened her thinking about authority. Florence understood that power often protected itself by obscuring responsibility. When no one was clearly accountable, failure could be distributed until it belonged to no one. She learned to track decisions, to note where responsibility dissolved, and to question arrangements that relied on ambiguity. This habit would later define her approach to reform. Clarity, she believed, was not cruelty. It was honesty. At home, tensions intensified. Florence's commitment began to restructure her life in visible ways. Social obligations were declined. Time once given to acceptable pursuits was redirected towards study and preparation. This withdrawal was not dramatic, but it was noticeable. Friends interpreted it as severity. Family members worried it signaled unhappiness. Florence did not attempt to reassure them with false cheer. She was not unhappy. She was focused. The prospect of lifelong work without conventional rewards did not frighten her as much as the alternative. A life spent protecting comfort while ignoring preventable harm felt intolerable. Florence recognized that choosing her path meant accepting isolation of a particular kind. She would be respected selectively, misunderstood, frequently, and approved of conditionally. This did not deter her. Approval, she had learned, was unreliable. Systems mattered more. As she moved deeper into preparation, Florence began to see nursing not as an endpoint, but as a means. The true work was not individual care, though that mattered. The work was organization, designing environments that reduced harm without requiring heroism, training people to deliver consistent care regardless of mood or circumstance, removing chance from survival wherever possible. This vision was ambitious, but it was grounded. It did not require miracles. It required persistence. Calling in this sense was not an inner voice urging her forward. It was an external reality pressing inward. Illness did not pause for etiquette. Neglect did not wait for readiness. Florence felt this pressure constantly. It did not overwhelm her. It clarified her priorities. Decisions became simpler, if not easier. Anything that did not contribute to reducing harm lost urgency. Her family eventually recognized that opposition would not reverse this course. Some offered reluctant support, others maintained quiet disapproval. Florence accepted both without resentment. She did not need agreement. She needed space to work. This emotional economy, limited and efficient, would later allow her to function in environments where sympathy was scarce and resistance constant. By the time Florence formally committed herself to nursing, the decision no longer felt like a leap. It felt like alignment. The discomfort that had once hovered at the edges of her life now had direction. It moved with her rather than against her. This did not bring peace. It brought momentum. Once aligned, it became difficult to justify delay. This was the stage at which Florence Nightingale ceased to be merely observant and became operational. The questions she asked were no longer speculative. They were practical. How many patients could a space hold before it became harmful? How long could air remain stale before it undermined recovery? How often did routines need to be repeated before they became reliable? These questions did not flatter existing institutions. They exposed them. Calling at this point stopped being personal. It became structural. Florence did not imagine herself as exceptional. She imagined that what she was learning could be taught, that standards could be transferred, that care could be built rather than improvised. This belief would eventually carry her far beyond the environments that first shaped it. As she moved forward, Florence carried with her a quiet awareness. Choosing responsibility did not guarantee success. It guaranteed confrontation with habit, with authority, with the comfort of those who preferred things to remain tolerable rather than better. She accepted this without drama. The work was already waiting. It did not require her permission. The night had not yet deepened into crisis. The fire had not yet appeared. But the conditions were set. A calling had taken shape, not as inspiration, but as refusal. refusal to accept neglect as inevitable, refusal to treat suffering as background noise, refusal to allow comfort to excuse indifference. Movement, once begun, did not slow, and the path ahead, though still dim, no longer felt optional. Learning that care is a system, not a feeling. Once Florence Nightingale stepped fully into training, the idea of calling lost its remaining softness. What replaced it was structure, days arranged by routine rather than inspiration, rooms governed by rules rather than moods, care stripped of its sentimental clothing and examined for what it actually accomplished. This transition did not feel like elevation. It felt like narrowing. Fewer options, fewer excuses, less room to hide behind intention. The environments she chose were not gentle. Discipline was visible everywhere. Cleanliness was enforced without apology. Schedules were followed whether they felt convenient or not. Florence did not resist this rigidity. She leaned into it. For the first time, she could observe care functioning without chaos, pretending to be compassion. What she found confirmed a suspicion she had carried quietly for years. When systems were clear, suffering decreased without drama. When responsibility was assigned, neglect became harder to justify. She learned quickly that emotion was unreliable as a foundation. Sympathy rose and fell, energy faded, attention wandered. Systems, when designed carefully, did not depend on how anyone felt that day. They depended on repetition. Floors were cleaned because it was scheduled. Air was refreshed because it was required. Patients were checked because someone was responsible. None of this required inspiration. That was the point. Florence noticed how often resistance came from habit rather than principle. People defended old practices not because they worked, but because they were familiar. Change was treated as disruption rather than correction. In training environments where rules were enforced consistently, these objections weakened. Results accumulated quietly. Infection rates dropped. Recovery improved. The absence of crisis felt anticlimactic. Florence recognized this as success. This period reshaped how she understood authority. In chaotic systems, authority often existed to protect hierarchy rather than outcomes. Titles mattered more than results. Orders traveled downward, consequences traveled nowhere. In disciplined environments, authority functioned differently. Responsibility was visible. Failure could be traced. Improvement could be measured. Florence found this clarity reassuring. It removed the need for argument. Evidence spoke. She became attentive to the smallest details, not out of obsession, but because small details repeated often enough became decisive. Linens changed regularly, altered recovery. Quiet hours preserved strength. Ventilation affected fever. These observations were not theoretical. They were practical and immediate. Florence recorded them carefully, not as anecdotes, but as patterns. Once patterns appeared, they could be taught. Training also revealed limits Florence had not previously considered. Care demanded restraint. Emotional excess exhausted caregivers and destabilized patients. Florence learned to regulate her own responses. This was not detachment, it was sustainability. Care that consumed its providers could not be repeated indefinitely. Structure protected both sides of the relationship. This understanding would later make her unpopular among those who equated intensity with sincerity. As her competence grew, so did her expectations. Florence began to demand from others what she demanded from herself: consistency, attention, accountability. This made collaboration difficult at times. She had little patience for improvisation when routine would suffice. She resisted explanations that relied on tradition rather than evidence. These traits were often described as severity. Florence understood them as respect for the work. She also became aware of how language shaped perception. Care was often described as instinctive, almost natural, particularly when performed by women. This framing excused poor training and low standards. If care was instinct, then failure could be dismissed as misfortune. Florence rejected this entirely. Care, she believed, was labor. It required education, discipline, and oversight. Treating it otherwise was a way of accepting harm. The implications of this belief extended beyond nursing. Florence began to see how institutions shielded themselves from scrutiny by romanticizing effort. Hard work was praised, even when it produced little improvement. Dedication was admired even when it replaced effectiveness. Florence learned to separate sincerity from results. This distinction would later make her arguments difficult to dismiss and equally difficult to accept. During this period, her writing intensified. Notes filled with observations, measurements, and reflections. She documented processes as carefully as outcomes. What happened before improvement mattered as much as the improvement itself. Florence was not interested in isolated success. She wanted reproducibility. If a method worked once, it needed to work again under similar conditions. Otherwise, it was coincidence. Her growing confidence did not translate into ease. Training clarified how much remained broken. The more she learned, the less tolerance she had for disorder disguised as inevitability. This sharpened her sense of urgency. Florence did not rush. She prepared. But preparation now had direction. She was no longer gathering knowledge out of curiosity. She was assembling tools. The distance between her and conventional expectations widened. Social approval became irrelevant. The world she was entering valued competence over charm. This suited her. Florence did not need to be liked. She needed systems to function. The isolation that accompanied this choice was real but manageable. Purpose narrowed focus. Focus reduced distraction. As she moved from training into early administrative roles, Florence tested what she had learned under less controlled conditions. Here, resistance returned. Staff accustomed to improvisation bristled at routine. Budgets revealed inefficiencies that had long gone unnoticed. Florence approached these challenges methodically. She reorganized responsibilities, clarified expectations, removed ambiguity wherever possible. Improvement followed slowly and without celebration. This reinforced a belief that would guide her for decades. Change did not require confrontation if it produced results. Opposition weakened when benefits became visible. Florence preferred this approach. It conserved energy and reduced conflict. She did not seek to defeat people. She sought to outlast ineffective practices. Her understanding of care now rested on three pillars. Environment mattered, routine mattered, accountability mattered. None of these depended on heroism. They depended on design. Florence found this deeply reassuring. If care relied on heroism, it would fail whenever heroes were absent. If it relied on systems, it could endure. By the end of this phase, Florence Nightingale was no longer experimenting. She was convinced. Care could be organized, suffering could be reduced deliberately. Neglect was not inevitable. It was often chosen through inattention and habit. This conclusion did not fill her with anger. It filled her with resolve. She also understood that proving these ideas in quiet institutions was only the beginning. The real test would come when systems were stressed, when resources were scarce, when authority resisted scrutiny. Training had prepared her to recognize disorder. It had not yet shown her how entrenched it could be. Still, she moved forward without hesitation. Knowledge had removed her last excuse for delay. Once something could be done, not doing it became indefensible. Florence accepted this burden without ceremony. The work ahead was already forming. It would require everything she had learned and more. The calling that once unsettled her family had now become a framework. The discomfort that once hovered without direction had taken shape. Florence did not yet know where this path would lead her, but she understood something essential. Care, when treated as a system rather than a feeling, had the power to expose failure on a scale that sentiment never could. The night remained quiet. The fire was still distant, but the structures that would soon be tested were already under strain, and Florence Nightingale was prepared to notice exactly where they broke. Clean water, quiet rules, and the shock of order. Once Florence Nightingale began to apply what she had learned outside the controlled environment of training, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Theory had been demanding. Practice was unsettling. Institutions that appeared functional on the surface revealed themselves as fragile when examined closely. Order existed in name only. Responsibility drifted. Routines dissolved the moment attention shifted elsewhere. Florence did not react with disappointment. She reacted with focus. This was the work she had been preparing for. Her earliest administrative roles placed her inside systems that were accustomed to surviving without scrutiny. Budgets were opaque. Supplies appeared and disappeared without explanation. Cleanliness depended on mood rather than obligation. Staff worked hard, but effort rarely translated into improvement. Florence observed all of this quietly. She did not accuse. She documented. Patterns emerged quickly. Neglect was not malicious. It was procedural. The first changes she introduced were almost embarrassingly simple. Cleaning schedules were written down and enforced. Supplies were tracked. Responsibilities were assigned clearly, rather than implied. These adjustments did not inspire admiration. They inspired irritation. People resent being reminded that disorder is optional. Florence expected this reaction. Resistance, she understood, was often a sign that a system had grown comfortable with its own inefficiency. Water became one of her earliest points of focus. Clean water was not treated as a given in many institutions. It was a convenience, sometimes present, often delayed. Florence approached it differently. She treated water as infrastructure. If water was unreliable, everything built upon it failed quietly. Hygiene deteriorated. Infection spread. Recovery slowed. She insisted on regular access, not as a luxury but as a requirement. This insistence unsettled administrators who had learned to tolerate compromise. Cleanliness followed naturally. Florence did not treat clean spaces as aesthetic preferences. She treated them as functional tools. Dirt accumulated because no one had been assigned the task of preventing it. Once responsibility was clear, cleanliness ceased to be heroic. It became routine. Floors were cleaned whether anyone noticed or not. Linens were changed on schedule. Waste was removed promptly. None of this required inspiration. It required discipline. These changes exposed an uncomfortable truth. Many deaths and complications previously attributed to fate were the result of environment. Florence did not announce this revelation dramatically. She allowed the numbers to speak. As conditions improved, outcomes improved. The correlation was difficult to dismiss. It did not flatter existing leadership. That, too, was part of the problem. Rules played a central role in this transformation. Florence understood that rules were not restrictions, they were protections. Clear rules removed ambiguity. They prevented the slow erosion of standards that occurred when everything depended on judgment alone. Staff initially resisted. Rules felt impersonal. Florence countered this unspoken objection with results. Fewer infections, faster recovery, less exhaustion. The rules remained. Her approach to staff discipline was similarly quiet and firm. Florence did not tolerate behavior that undermined care, regardless of intention. Negligence dressed as fatigue was still negligence. Improvisation that introduced risk was still failure. She was not unkind, but she was exacting. Expectations were communicated clearly. Those who could not meet them were removed. This decisiveness earned her criticism. Florence accepted it as a cost of improvement. What unsettled many observers was how little drama accompanied these reforms. There were no speeches about morality, no appeals to virtue. Florence treated care as work. Work improved when organized. This framing stripped away excuses that had long protected mediocrity. It also challenged the comforting belief that suffering was inevitable. Once reduced, it was difficult to argue that it had ever been necessary. Her administrative work revealed another pattern Florence found troubling. Institutions often praised dedication while ignoring outcomes. Staff who worked tirelessly were admired even when conditions remained harmful. Florence rejected this logic. Effort without effect was not admirable. It was unsustainable. She believed that care deserved the same evaluation as any other form of labor. Did it achieve its purpose? If not, why not? This emphasis on outcomes required measurement. Florence began to collect data systematically. She tracked admissions, recoveries, complications, and deaths. She compared conditions before and after interventions. Numbers replaced anecdotes. Trends replaced impressions. This shift unsettled those accustomed to authority based on experience rather than evidence. Florence did not dismiss experience. She contextualized it. The shock of order extended beyond physical spaces. It altered expectations. Staff accustomed to improvisation found themselves constrained by routine. Administrators accustomed to ambiguity found themselves accountable. Florence did not apologize for this discomfort. She saw it as evidence that change was occurring. Order, when introduced into chaotic systems, often feels intrusive. That feeling fades as benefits accumulate. Not everyone adapted. Some left voluntarily, others were dismissed. Florence accepted this attrition without regret. Systems, she believed, could not be built around the lowest standard without harming everyone else. This stance hardened her reputation. She was described as severe, inflexible, demanding. Florence did not dispute these descriptions. She simply questioned whether flexibility had ever served the patients well. As her reforms took hold, the improvements became difficult to ignore. Spaces grew quieter. Illness spread less rapidly. Recovery became more predictable. These changes did not attract applause. They reduced the need for it. Florence recognized this as a paradox of effective reform. When systems work, they disappear from attention. Crisis attracts notice. Stability rarely does. This invisibility suited her. Florence was not interested in recognition, she was interested in durability. A system that required constant supervision to function was fragile. Her goal was to create arrangements that sustained themselves through routine. When staff followed schedules without thinking about them, success had been achieved. The simplicity of these reforms disturbed many observers. They expected complexity. They expected specialized knowledge or exceptional talent. Instead, they saw water, air, cleanliness, and accountability. Florence understood why this simplicity was unsettling. It suggested that neglect had been tolerated unnecessarily. It implied responsibility where none had been claimed before. As these ideas spread, Florence encountered growing resistance from those who felt exposed by comparison. Institutions that had not reformed began to appear careless. Florence did not exploit this contrast publicly. She allowed it to speak for itself. Change, she believed, was most effective when it appeared inevitable rather than imposed. Her work during this period solidified a conviction that would guide her through far more difficult circumstances. Disorder thrived in darkness. Order required visibility. When processes were hidden, failure multiplied. When they were exposed, improvement followed. Florence did not fear exposure. She welcomed it. Systems that could not withstand scrutiny deserved to change. By the time she moved beyond these early administrative roles, Florence Nightingale had demonstrated something quietly revolutionary. Care did not need heroism, it needed design, clean water, quiet rules, clear responsibility. The shock was not that these changes worked. The shock was how long they had been avoided. She understood now that these principles would face their greatest test, not in small institutions, but in crisis, when resources were strained, when authority resisted interference, when chaos was defended as necessity. Florence sensed that such a test was approaching. The world beyond her current work was restless. Conflict was spreading. Systems built on habit would soon be pushed beyond tolerance. The lamp remained unlit. The fire had not yet arrived, but Florence Nightingale had already learned how order behaved under pressure. She had seen how small adjustments altered outcomes. She'd witnessed resistance dissolve in the face of evidence. These lessons would soon be required on a scale far beyond anything she had yet encountered. For now, she continued quietly, adjusting routines, refining systems, reducing harm without announcement. The night was still deceptively calm, and beneath that calm, the conditions for catastrophe were forming, waiting for a moment when attention could no longer be avoided. War did not create her. It removed the excuses. When war finally arrived, it did not introduce chaos so much as it enlarged what had already been tolerated. Conflict has a way of stripping systems of their polite disguises. It takes small inefficiencies and stretches them until they become visible failures. It removes the comfort of delay. What could once be postponed now demanded explanation. For Florence Nightingale, the approach of war did not feel like a turning point. It felt like confirmation. Reports began to circulate quietly at first. Soldiers were not dying only from wounds. They were dying from conditions that followed them home from the battlefield. Filth, infection, neglect. The language used to describe these losses was careful and distant. Numbers were presented without context. Causes were blurred. Responsibility drifted. Florence recognized the pattern immediately. She'd seen it in smaller institutions where disorder was defended as unavoidable. War simply removed the space to pretend. Public attention shifted uneasily. Confidence faltered. Questions surfaced that could no longer be dismissed as impatience. How could a modern nation allow such conditions to persist? Why were men surviving battle only to succumb to environments meant to heal them? These questions did not yet demand reform. They demanded reassurance. Florence understood the difference. Reassurance preserved appearances. Reform altered systems. When the opportunity came for her to step into this expanding failure, it did not arrive wrapped in ceremony. There was no formal invitation to reshape care. There was a request to help, vague enough to protect existing authority and specific enough to acknowledge that something had gone wrong. Florence accepted without hesitation, not because she believed she could fix everything, but because refusal would have meant accepting excuses she no longer believed. She arrived to find structures that looked intact until examined closely. Hospitals that functioned on paper collapsed under actual use. Supplies existed in theory but not in practice. Responsibilities overlapped just enough to ensure that no one felt fully accountable. The environment itself worked against recovery. Air stagnated. Water sources were compromised. Waste accumulated where it should never have been allowed to remain. None of this was new. It had simply been allowed to continue. Florence did not react with outrage. She did not need to. Outrage would have required energy she intended to conserve. Instead, she observed. She documented. She began where she always began, with what could be changed immediately. Cleaning was enforced. Ventilation was improved where possible. Food distribution was reorganized. These actions did not challenge authority directly. They challenged neglect. Resistance surfaced quickly. Military structures are protective by nature. They interpret intervention as criticism. Florence understood this and adjusted accordingly. She did not frame her actions as correction. She framed them as support. She avoided language that implied blame. She focused on outcomes. As conditions improved, opposition softened. It became harder to argue against results that reduced suffering without disrupting command. The scale of the problem soon exceeded what local adjustments could resolve. Disease spread faster than reform. Mortality rates climbed despite effort. Florence recognized that environmental conditions were overwhelming even disciplined care. Water sources contaminated entire wards. Waste disposal systems failed completely. Ventilation remained inadequate. These were not nursing problems. They were infrastructural failures. At this stage, Florence shifted strategy. She began to communicate outward. Letters traveled beyond the immediate environment, carrying precise descriptions and measured observations. She avoided dramatic language. She described conditions plainly, knowing that clarity could be more unsettling than accusation. These communications did not demand action. They made inaction increasingly indefensible. The response was slow, as institutional responses often are. Committees formed. Inspections were promised. Meanwhile, Florence continued to work within the limits available to her. She did not wait for permission to improve what could be improved. She also did not pretend that local effort alone could resolve systemic failure. This balance required patience. It also required restraint. Florence understood that visible confrontation might satisfy frustration, but undermine long-term change. During this period, her presence became more widely known. She moved through wards quietly, often at night, observing conditions when supervision was minimal. These rounds were not performances. They were inspections. She listened to patients. She noted patterns. She recorded details others dismissed as trivial. This attention unsettled staff accustomed to anonymity. Being seen altered behavior. Florence relied on this effect without advertising it. The image that later emerged from these nights simplified reality into something gentler. A solitary figure moving through darkness with a lamp. The truth was less symbolic. The lamp was practical. The darkness was systemic. Florence was not comforting men so much as witnessing failure directly. Witnessing, she believed, created responsibility. As the scale of suffering became undeniable, external intervention finally arrived. Sanitary inspections exposed what Florence had already documented. Structural flaws were identified. Environmental hazards were acknowledged. Once addressed, mortality rates declined sharply. The numbers told a story that could not be softened. Conditions, not courage, had been killing men. Florence did not celebrate this outcome. It did not feel like victory. It felt like correction delayed too long. The reduction in deaths did not erase those already lost. It did, however, remove any remaining excuse for denial. Systems could be changed. Outcomes could improve. The implication was unavoidable. Throughout this period, Florence's own health deteriorated. Exhaustion accumulated. Illness followed. She did not interpret this as martyrdom. She accepted it as cost. Work at this scale extracted payment regardless of intention. Florence did not complain publicly. She adjusted privately. Rest was rationed. Effort was prioritized. The work continued. Public perception began to shift. Florence became a figure onto which reassurance could be projected. Her competence offered relief in a narrative crowded with failure. She did not resist this symbolism openly. She understood its utility. A symbol could open doors that arguments could not. She used attention selectively, allowing it to amplify reform rather than personal acclaim. Behind this emerging image was a reality far less comforting. Florence's work exposed how thoroughly systems had failed under pressure. War had not created these failures. It had revealed them. The conditions that harmed soldiers had existed in peacetime institutions as well. They had simply been less visible. Florence recognized that the implications extended far beyond the conflict at hand. As the war continued, she became increasingly aware of the limits of intervention without authority. Change occurred, but slowly. Resistance persisted in quieter forms. Habits returned when attention lapsed. Florence learned that reform required endurance beyond crisis. Systems often improved temporarily under scrutiny, only to regress once urgency faded. Preventing this regression would become her next challenge. By the time her role in the war drew to a close, Florence Nightingale had witnessed disorder at its most extreme and correction at its most fragile. She'd seen how quickly neglect multiplied when hidden and how rapidly it receded when exposed. She had also seen how institutions preferred to remember success while forgetting the conditions that made it necessary. The war did not transform Florence. It clarified her. It removed the final argument for patience. Once lives were counted, delay could no longer be justified as prudence. Florence carried this clarity with her as the conflict receded. The night that had seemed quiet before now felt deceptive. Calm, she understood, was not the same as stability. The fire had arrived and revealed the structure beneath. The lamp had been used not to illuminate heroism, but to expose failure. What Florence took from this experience was not confidence, but obligation. Systems that could be corrected under crisis demanded correction in peace. Anything less would be a return to pretense. As she prepared to leave the immediate environment of war, Florence did not imagine herself stepping away from responsibility. She imagined it expanding. The work ahead would not involve emergency response. It would involve memory, documentation, reform that persisted after attention moved elsewhere. War had removed the excuses. Peace would test whether anything had truly been learned. The lamp was never the point. As attention gathered around Florence Nightingale, it did so unevenly, selecting details that felt comforting and discarding those that felt accusatory. People did not want to look directly at the systems that had failed under pressure. They wanted a figure, something human, manageable, and reassuring. The image that emerged was simple and repeatable: a woman, a lamp, darkness held at bay by quiet devotion. It was an image that allowed the story to end gently, even though the reality did not. Florence noticed this transformation with a mixture of distance and restraint. She did not object publicly. Symbols, she understood, had uses. They could travel where arguments stalled. They could soften resistance that data alone could not overcome. Still, she remained aware of what the image concealed. The lamp did not reduce mortality. Clean water did. The lamp did not stop infection. Ventilation and hygiene did. The lamp did not reorganize supply chains or clarify responsibility. Systems did. Her nightly rounds, which later became legend, were never intended as comfort performances. They were inspections conducted when supervision relaxed and routines faltered. Night revealed what daylight concealed. Shortcuts taken, responsibilities deferred, conditions tolerated because no one expected to be observed. Florence moved quietly, not to dramatize her presence, but to preserve accuracy. The lamp was practical. It illuminated details she needed to see. Patients responded to her presence in ways observers later misunderstood. Gratitude existed, certainly. Relief as well. But what Florence noticed most was recognition. Being seen altered how suffering was experienced. Men who had been reduced to numbers felt briefly returned to themselves. This mattered, but not in the way sentiment preferred to describe it. Recognition did not cure illness. It revealed it. It made neglect harder to dismiss. Florence understood that visibility created accountability. When someone witnessed conditions directly, excuses weakened. When that witness documented what they saw, denial became difficult. The lamp allowed her to move through spaces that had grown accustomed to darkness. It did not sanctify them, it exposed them. This exposure unsettled those who relied on invisibility to maintain authority. As stories circulated, they softened edges. Florence became gentler in retelling than she was in practice. Her insistence on discipline, her intolerance for negligence, her relentless documentation rarely appeared in public accounts. These traits complicated the image. A symbol needed to be approachable. Florence allowed this simplification to persist, knowing that resistance often softened when reform arrived, disguised as reassurance. Behind the image, work continued. Florence refined routines. She enforced standards, she recorded outcomes. Attention brought resources, but also interference. Visitors arrived expecting inspiration. Florence redirected them toward logistics. Admiration did not interest her. Improvement did. She learned quickly how to navigate the growing distance between perception and reality. This period taught her something essential about reform. Change often travels faster when it does not announce itself as criticism. The lamp story did not accuse anyone directly. It offered comfort. Meanwhile, reforms took hold quietly. Sanitation improved. Supply chains stabilized. Mortality declined. The public celebrated the symbol. Florence leveraged the results. She remained cautious. Symbols have a tendency to replace understanding. People who believed the problem had been solved by devotion alone lost interest in structural reform. Florence resisted this complacency carefully. She emphasized routine rather than heroism. She redirected praise toward process. She reminded anyone who would listen that improvement depended on repetition, not inspiration. Her discomfort with the image was not moral, it was practical. A system that relied on exceptional individuals would fail when those individuals were absent. Florence did not want to become indispensable. She wanted the work to continue without her. This required shifting attention from presence to procedure, from character to design. Yet the lamp persisted. It appeared in newspapers, speeches, and public imagination. Florence accepted its persistence as a trade. If the image opened doors, she would walk through them, carrying data rather than sentiment. She used attention to press for inspections, resources, and authority. The symbol functioned as a key. She used it without mistaking it for the lock. This balancing act required discipline. Florence limited her visibility deliberately. She avoided public appearances when possible. She refused interviews that focused on personality rather than outcomes. When praise arrived, she redirected it toward the work. This restraint frustrated admirers who wanted affirmation. Florence did not provide it. Gratitude, she believed, was not a plan. As the war progressed, the contrast between symbol and system grew sharper. Public confidence rose even as Florence remained acutely aware of how fragile improvements were. Habits returned quickly when attention shifted. Supplies delayed by bureaucracy undermined routines. Authority resisted permanent change. Florence responded with documentation rather than complaint. She recorded regressions as carefully as progress. Her relationship with those around her remained precise. She demanded standards without apology. She dismissed staff who undermined care regardless of intention. This firmness complicated the public image further. A gentle figure, enforcing strict discipline, did not fit easily into the narrative. Florence did not attempt to reconcile this contradiction. She allowed others to resolve it however they wished. What she did insist upon was continuity. Reforms introduced during crisis needed to persist afterward. Temporary improvement was insufficient. Florence began to think beyond the immediate context. How would lessons be preserved once urgency faded? How could memory be institutionalized? These questions occupied her increasingly as attention peaked. The lamp story, she realized, risked doing the opposite. It suggested that care was personal rather than systemic, that compassion alone could resolve failure. Florence countered this implication subtly. She emphasized training. She highlighted routine. She spoke of environments rather than individuals. Slowly, she attempted to redirect admiration toward structures that could endure. This effort met mixed success. Symbols are resilient because they are simple. Systems are complex because they are real. Florence accepted that she could not fully control how she was remembered. She focused instead on what could be built while attention lasted. Influence, she understood, was temporary. Reform needed to outlive it. Her own energy declined as the work continued. Illness limited her mobility. Fatigue sharpened her focus. She became even more selective in how she spent effort. The lamp rounds continued when possible, but their function shifted. They reinforced visibility. They reminded staff that standards were observed. They sustained pressure without confrontation. Florence did not resent the symbol. She simply refused to believe in it. The lamp did not make her work meaningful. The work gave the lamp purpose. This distinction mattered to her. It prevented complacency. It preserved urgency. As the war approached its end, public interest began to drift. New concerns emerged. Attention shifted elsewhere. Florence anticipated this moment. Symbols fade quickly once their immediate use passes. Systems, if built carefully, remain. She intensified her efforts to document practices, codify routines, and preserve knowledge. Memory, she believed, was a form of infrastructure. The lamp would soon be set down, not because darkness had disappeared, but because its function had changed. Florence prepared for this transition quietly. She did not announce an ending. She organized continuity. The image had served its purpose. It had opened space for reform. What mattered now was ensuring that space did not close once the light moved on. In this sense, the lamp was never the point. It was a means, a practical object repurposed into symbol by a public eager for reassurance. Florence allowed the reassurance to exist while she worked elsewhere. In rooms where processes were written, in ledgers where outcomes were recorded, in routines that persisted without witnesses. As attention dimmed, the night returned to its familiar quiet. The systems beneath it remained altered, though still fragile. Florence understood that the next phase would require a different kind of work. Less visible, more patient. Focused not on exposure, but on permanence. The fire had burned brightly enough to reveal failure. The lamp had illuminated it long enough to force change. What remained now was the harder task, ensuring that when darkness returned, it did not erase what had been seen. Numbers that made death difficult to ignore. As the attention surrounding Florence Nightingale slowly softened into familiarity, she withdrew from the surface of the story and moved deeper into its structure. Symbols had done what symbols could do. They had opened space. They had made failure visible enough to provoke response. But symbols could not hold that space indefinitely. Admiration fades quickly. Habit returns quietly. Florence understood this instinctively. If reform was to survive the waning of attention, it would require a language that did not depend on emotion at all. That language was numbers. She began to translate experience into measurement, not because she believed lives could be reduced to figures, but because she understood that institutions already reduced them poorly. Deaths disappeared into vague categories, causes blurred into general misfortune. Responsibility dissolved in language that sounded neutral and therefore harmless. Florence reorganized this fog into structure. She counted carefully. She aligned outcomes with conditions. She placed results next to decisions and allowed the relationship to become visible. This work was meticulous and slow. Records were incomplete. Reports contradicted one another. Definitions shifted depending on who had written them. Florence adjusted for this without complaint. She cross-checked sources. She preserved context. She resisted the temptation to simplify prematurely. Accuracy mattered more than speed. If the figures were to challenge authority, they needed to withstand scrutiny. Patterns emerged steadily. Mortality rose in poorly ventilated spaces. It declined where sanitation improved. Disease spread where water was contaminated and retreated when sources were secured. These relationships repeated across locations and circumstances. They did not depend on heroism or morale, they depended on environment. Florence treated these patterns as statements rather than arguments. This is what happens here. This is what changes there. The act of counting unsettled many observers. Suffering, they believed, should not be dissected so clinically. Florence understood this discomfort but did not share it. To her, refusing to count was not respectful. It was evasive. A death that remained uncounted could not challenge the system that allowed it. A pattern that remained invisible could not be corrected. Numbers, when used honestly, protected memory from being overwritten by convenience. She became increasingly careful in how she presented her findings. Florence avoided emotional framing. She did not describe suffering vividly. She allowed figures to carry weight on their own. Mortality rates before intervention, mortality rates after. Conditions unchanged, conditions altered. The contrast did not require explanation. It produced its own unease. Visual representation became an extension of this approach. Relationships that seemed abstract in text became unmistakable when arranged spatially. Trends revealed themselves at a glance. Declines followed reform. Increases followed neglect. Florence used these representations not to persuade emotionally, but to remove ambiguity. They left little room for interpretation and no room for denial. Her correspondence during this period shifted tone. Letters that once described conditions now carried tables and summaries. Florence understood that decision-makers rarely resisted information because it was wrong. They resisted it because it was inconvenient. Precision reduced the ability to delay. When numbers were clear, postponement became visible as choice rather than caution. This changed how she was received. Admiration cooled. Engagement sharpened. Officials began to approach her work carefully, aware that it exposed connections they preferred remain implicit. Florence did not seek confrontation. She allowed discomfort to do the work. Silence, she learned, often followed understanding. As her methods expanded beyond the wartime context, Florence applied the same discipline to civilian environments. Hospitals that had never faced the scrutiny of crisis revealed similar patterns. Overcrowding increased mortality. Poor drainage amplified disease. Inadequate ventilation weakened recovery. These were not failures of compassion. They were failures of design. Florence treated them accordingly. India became an especially revealing case. Though physically distant, it produced extensive administrative records. Florence reorganized these documents patiently. She compared regions. She aligned outcomes with infrastructure. The distance stripped away personal narrative and left structure exposed. Mortality was not mysterious. It followed governance. This implication was uncomfortable. Florence did not soften it. Her work increasingly reframed responsibility. Illness ceased to be an individual misfortune and became a systemic outcome. This reframing did not assign blame automatically. It assigned obligation. Once causes were visible, ignoring them became a decision rather than an accident. Florence understood the weight of this shift. It altered how reform would be resisted and how it would be justified. Criticism followed predictably. Some accused her of coldness, others argued that reducing life to figures stripped it of dignity. Florence did not respond directly. She pointed instead to what changed when figures guided reform. Fewer deaths, shorter recoveries, less suffering. The dignity, she believed, lay in prevention rather than description. Her own health continued to decline during this period. Physical weakness confined her increasingly to interior spaces where movement was limited. Florence adapted without complaint. The work she was doing required focus rather than motion, calculation rather than presence. The quiet suited her. In isolation, distraction faded. The work intensified. She became acutely aware of the fragility of memory. Reforms introduced under scrutiny often receded when attention moved elsewhere. Florence worked to counter this by embedding measurement into routine. Reporting became expected rather than exceptional. Evaluation became part of administration rather than an intrusion. These changes lacked drama. They endured. Florence also recognized the limits of numbers. Data could reveal patterns, but it could not enforce action alone. Authority still needed motivation. She used timing carefully. Findings were presented when alternatives were defensible and denial costly. She avoided spectacle. Public confrontation risked entrenchment. Quiet persistence proved more effective. This period marked a shift in how Florence understood influence. Symbols attracted attention, numbers sustained it. Together they created pressure that could not easily dissipate. Florence balanced both without confusing them. The lamp belonged to the story. The figures belonged to the work. Over time, institutions adjusted, not uniformly, not permanently, but measurably. Mortality declined where standards held. It rose where they did not. The pattern repeated often enough to become difficult to ignore. Florence did not claim victory. She documented movement. By the end of this phase, the language of reform had changed. Suffering was no longer discussed solely in moral terms. It was discussed in administrative ones. This shift unsettled many. It also saved lives. Florence believed that unease was a reasonable cost. The night grew quieter again as attention drifted elsewhere. But something remained altered beneath the surface. Death had been given shape. Shape invited response. Response created responsibility. Florence knew this was not an ending. It was groundwork laid patiently beneath future crises. The lamp had opened the door. The fire had exposed the structure. Now the numbers remained, cool and persistent, waiting for the next moment when someone would choose whether to look away or act. Becoming a symbol while refusing the role. As the numbers settled into institutions and began their slow work of rearranging responsibility, a parallel process unfolded around Florence Nightingale herself. The public, having followed the story through crisis and reassurance, needed an ending that felt human and manageable. Systems were difficult to admire. Data was uncomfortable to remember. What remained was the figure who had moved through the darkness with a lamp. The story tightened around her, simplifying edges, smoothing friction, and quietly assigning her a role she had never agreed to play. Florence noticed this shift with practiced awareness. She understood why it happened. Societies prefer symbols because symbols conclude narratives cleanly. They allow attention to rest. They transform complexity into character. Florence did not challenge this process openly. To do so would have redirected attention toward herself rather than the work. Instead, She learned to operate within the narrowing frame without being contained by it. Public admiration intensified as distance from the war increased. The mess of reform faded from memory. The figure remained. Florence became a representation of care rather than its architecture. She was described as gentle, tireless, almost instinctively compassionate. These descriptions were not false, but they were incomplete. They omitted discipline. They omitted severity. They omitted the countless decisions that had little to do with kindness and everything to do with control. Florence understood the danger of this omission. A symbol that suggested care arose naturally from goodness, risked erasing the labor required to sustain it. If care appeared instinctive, it could be dismissed as optional. If reform appeared personal, it could vanish with the person. Florence resisted this quietly. She redirected conversations. She emphasized training. She spoke of systems rather than stories. Often, she was not heard. The image persisted because it was useful. It allowed institutions to celebrate progress without fully examining what had necessitated it. Florence did not seek to dismantle this comfort directly. She used it strategically. Admiration opened doors that evidence alone sometimes could not. Invitations arrived. Audiences listened. Florence entered these spaces carrying proposals rather than gratitude. Her reluctance to perform the role assigned to her confused many. She declined public ceremonies. She resisted appearances that centered on personality. She avoided rhetoric that praised devotion without addressing design. This restraint frustrated admirers who wanted affirmation. Florence offered none. She believed gratitude was fleeting and reform required endurance. Behind the scenes, she worked to anchor change in places the public rarely observed. Training programs were formalized, standards were written, expectations were clarified. Florence treated these documents with the same seriousness she had given to data. Language mattered. Ambiguity created gaps where neglect could return. Precision preserved intent. This work exposed a tension she navigated constantly. Symbols thrive on simplicity. Systems require complexity. Florence balanced both by allowing the symbol to exist while refusing to let it define the work. She did not correct every misinterpretation. She corrected processes. Over time, this quiet insistence reshaped outcomes, even as narratives lagged behind. Her relationship with authority evolved accordingly. Officials who had once welcomed her as reassurance now approached her cautiously. Proposals accompanied by evidence demanded commitment. Florence did not threaten. She persisted. Meetings ended without resolution more often than not. Florence recorded them anyway. Delay, she knew, was a decision disguised as prudence. As her influence extended into peacetime institutions, the limitations of symbolic reform became clearer. Without crisis, urgency faded. Habits returned. Budgets tightened. Oversight weakened. Florence responded not with alarm but with preparation. She understood that peacetime reform required patience of a different kind. Less visible, more persistent. She withdrew further from public view as her health declined. Illness constrained her movement and narrowed her days. Florence adapted her work to this confinement. Letters replaced presence. Reports replaced inspection. Her reach extended even as her physical world shrank. This withdrawal was often interpreted as retreat. It was not. It was concentration. During this period, Florence confronted an uncomfortable reality. Symbols outlive the work that created them. Over time, her image would likely survive more intact than her reforms. She accepted this possibility without bitterness. Memory, she believed, was rarely fair. Her responsibility lay with outcomes, not remembrance. This acceptance did not dull her resolve, it sharpened it. Florence focused on embedding change deeply enough that it would persist, even when misunderstood. Training became her primary concern. A profession could carry standards forward without requiring her presence. Nurses trained to observe, document, and maintain routines would reproduce the work more reliably than admiration ever could. She insisted that training remain rigorous and secular. Care tied too closely to sentiment risked drifting back into improvisation. Florence wanted consistency. She wanted competence. She wanted accountability that did not depend on character alone. This insistence met resistance. Many preferred care framed as moral calling rather than disciplined labor. Florence remained unmoved. As her methods spread, so did selective memory. Institutions adopted routines without acknowledging their origins. Florence did not object. Ownership mattered less than continuity. If standards held, attribution was irrelevant. She was content to be absent from the story, if the story continued to function. Public discourse, however, continued to circle her image. Debates emerged around personality rather than policy. Comparisons were drawn between different figures of care, as if history required competition. Florence declined to participate. Rivalry distracted from responsibility. She focused instead on structures that reduced harm regardless of who received credit. Her correspondence during these years reveals a growing awareness of time. Florence wrote with urgency tempered by realism. Reform was slow. Regression was common. Progress required vigilance long after enthusiasm faded. She accepted this rhythm. Change, she believed, was less like victory and more like maintenance. The role of symbol remained a useful inconvenience. It granted access while obscuring labor. Florence navigated this contradiction carefully. She used the symbol to protect the work from premature dismissal. She refused to let it replace the work entirely. This balance was difficult and often lonely. As decades passed, Florence became increasingly aware that she was being remembered differently than she had lived. The stories emphasized presence over planning, compassion over calculation, light over structure. Florence did not attempt to correct this imbalance comprehensively. She corrected it where it mattered most, in policy, in training, in routine. Her declining health imposed further limits. Energy was rationed, focus narrowed. Florence prioritized efforts that promised longevity. Systems that could not be institutionalized were set aside. She concentrated on reforms that would persist without constant defense. This pragmatism shaped her later work profoundly. The symbol, meanwhile, hardened into permanence. The lamp became shorthand. Darkness became backdrop. Complexity disappeared. Florence observed this with detachment. Symbols simplify because societies need rest. She did not begrudge them that. She only refused to let rest become reversal. By the end of this phase, Florence Nightingale occupied an unusual position. Celebrated yet constrained. Admired yet misunderstood. Present in memory yet increasingly absent from daily operations. She accepted this paradox as the cost of effective reform. The work had never required applause. It required continuity. The night around her work grew quieter as attention shifted elsewhere. New concerns emerged. New stories demanded symbols of their own. Florence did not chase relevance. She focused on endurance. The structures she had helped build continued to operate, imperfectly but measurably, better than before. Becoming a symbol had not been her choice. Refusing to be defined by it had been. In the space between admiration and accuracy, Florence Nightingale chose persistence. She allowed the image to remain while she worked elsewhere, in documents, in training, in routines that outlived visibility. The lamp would continue to glow in memory long after the details faded. Florence accepted this with calm clarity. What mattered was not how the story ended, but whether the systems it interrupted ever fully returned to darkness. Power without title, influence without applause. As public attention drifted toward new concerns and older crises settled into memory, Florence Nightingale entered the most demanding phase of her work. There were no corridors to patrol now, no wards whose conditions could be changed by presence alone. The stage had emptied. What remained was influence stripped of visibility, power exercised without title, reform pursued without applause. Florence understood that this phase would be quieter than the last and far more resistant to closure. Her health no longer allowed constant movement. Illness confined her to rooms where days blended together, and energy required careful rationing. This limitation did not reduce her reach. It altered its shape. Florence transformed confinement into concentration. Letters replaced inspections, reports replaced rounds. The work became slower, denser, and more deliberate. She wrote constantly, shaping policy from a distance through persistence rather than proximity. These letters were not appeals, they were instruments. Each addressed a specific failure or opportunity, supported by data, context, and practical recommendation. Florence avoided emotional framing. She did not describe suffering vividly. She described mechanisms, where responsibility dissolved, where oversight failed, where small adjustments would produce measurable improvement. This precision unsettled recipients, accustomed to broad praise or generalized criticism. Her letters demanded engagement. She learned quickly that influence did not require formal authority if clarity was sustained long enough. Officials changed positions, committees dissolved, governments shifted. The letters remained. Florence relied on continuity rather than alignment. She addressed institutions rather than individuals, knowing that people moved on while structures persisted. Memory, she believed, could be designed. During this period, her focus shifted decisively toward education and replication. Crisis reform had shown what was possible. Long-term reform required transmission. Florence believed that systems changed most reliably when those within them were trained to observe, document, and maintain standards without supervision. Nursing education became the core of this strategy. She insisted on training that emphasized discipline over sentiment, observation over impulse, routine over improvisation. This insistence was controversial. Many preferred to frame care as an extension of character rather than a learned practice. Florence rejected this distinction. Care that depended on character alone could not be trusted under pressure. Training created reliability. Reliability saved lives. The establishment of formal training programs required negotiation and compromise. Religious institutions resisted secular approaches. Administrators resisted cost. Practitioners resisted evaluation. Florence navigated these tensions patiently. She framed training as efficiency rather than ideology. Skilled nurses reduced waste. Standardized routines reduced error. The language of benefit proved persuasive where moral arguments stalled. As these programs expanded, Florence monitored outcomes carefully. Training was adjusted based on results rather than tradition. This iterative approach reflected her broader philosophy. Reform was not a declaration, it was maintenance. Systems required attention long after their introduction. Neglect returned quietly. Florence built safeguards where possible. Documentation, reporting, evaluation. None of these attracted praise. They endured. Her work also extended into public health beyond hospitals. Urban sanitation, housing conditions, institutional oversight. Florence applied the same analytical lens everywhere. Where environment undermined health, reform was necessary. Where responsibility was diffuse, accountability needed clarification. She did not frame these concerns as moral crusades. She framed them as administrative obligations. India remained a persistent focus. Colonial governance produced extensive data that Florence continued to analyze from afar. She identified preventable causes of mortality and proposed infrastructural changes. Distance did not dilute responsibility. It revealed it. Florence understood that power exercised remotely still produced outcomes locally. This understanding shaped her approach to reform broadly. Authority could not escape obligation by claiming separation. Throughout this period, Florence remained skeptical of recognition. Honors were offered, ceremonies proposed. She declined most. Visibility consumed energy she preferred to invest elsewhere. Public affirmation risked simplifying work that required nuance. Florence did not mistake obscurity for humility. She chose it for efficiency. Criticism continued, often quietly. Some accused her of rigidity. Others suggested her methods lacked warmth. Florence did not dispute these characterizations. She measured success differently. Warmth did not prevent infection. Flexibility did not ensure consistency. She accepted the trade-offs without regret. Her correspondence reveals a growing awareness of fatigue, not only personal but institutional. Reforms introduced enthusiastically often lost momentum. Budget pressures returned. Oversight weakened. Florence responded by prioritizing reforms that could sustain themselves. She abandoned efforts that required constant defense. This selectivity shaped her later influence more than ambition ever could. The absence of formal power sharpened her understanding of leverage. Influence flowed through timing, persistence, and evidence rather than command. Florence learned when to press and when to wait. Silence, she discovered, could be strategic. A delayed response sometimes achieved more than immediate objection. This patience was not passive, it was calculated. As years passed, Florence became increasingly conscious that she was preparing the work for a future she would not see. This awareness did not sadden her. It clarified priorities. Reforms needed to function independently. Institutions needed to remember standards without her intervention. This requirement guided every decision. If a change depended on her presence, it was insufficient. Her health continued to decline, further narrowing her world. Days were structured around limited bursts of energy. Writing occupied most of them. The physical stillness contrasted sharply with the reach of her influence. Policies shaped by her recommendations appeared in places she would never visit. Training programs adopted standards she had refined in isolation. The work moved outward, even as she remained still. Florence also confronted the inevitability of simplification. Over time, stories would replace structures in memory. Her image would persist more readily than her methods. She accepted this without resentment. Memory, she understood, followed its own logic. Her responsibility was to outcomes, not narratives. This acceptance freed her from defensiveness. She did not attempt to control legacy. She focused on embedding change deeply enough that it would persist, regardless of attribution. If institutions forgot her name but retained her standards, the work had succeeded. As she aged, Florence's tone softened without losing precision. Her letters became more reflective but no less exacting. She acknowledged uncertainty where evidence was incomplete. She resisted overconfidence. This restraint strengthened her credibility. Influence built on honesty endured longer than authority built on certainty. The quiet of this phase contrasted sharply with earlier visibility. There were no lamps, no headlines, no symbols, only documents moving through bureaucratic channels, altering procedures incrementally. Florence found this work more honest. It lacked drama. It required endurance. It matched the reality of reform. By the end of this period, Florence Nightingale occupied a position both powerful and invisible. She held no office. She commanded no staff directly. Yet her standards shaped practice across institutions and borders. This paradox did not trouble her. Power, she believed, was most effective when it did not announce itself. The night around her work deepened as attention moved elsewhere. Florence remained focused. The systems she had influenced continued to operate, imperfectly but measurably, better than before. This improvement was not guaranteed. It required vigilance. Florence had done what she could to build it into routine. As her energy waned, she prepared for closure without conclusion. The work would never be finished. It would only be maintained by those who came after. Florence accepted this calmly. Influence without applause had been her most effective form of power. The story now approached its quietest point. No crisis, no spectacle, only the long tale of reform extending beyond the moment that had made it necessary. Florence Nightingale remained present within this extension, not as a figure, but as a framework. And frameworks, once built carefully, endure long after attention fades. What remains when the lamp is no longer needed? In the final years of Florence Nightingale's life, very little looked dramatic from the outside. There were no last speeches, no final confrontations, no carefully staged conclusions. The world did not gather itself for a closing scene. It simply continued, slightly altered, carrying forward habits that no longer remembered why they existed. This quiet continuation would have pleased her more than any ceremony ever could. Florence spent much of this time confined to rooms that grew familiar in their stillness. Illness narrowed her days, limited her energy, and removed her almost entirely from public life. To observers, this absence appeared like withdrawal. To Florence, it felt like focus sharpened by necessity. With fewer hours available, only the most essential work remained: writing, reading, thinking, refining ideas that no longer needed urgency, only clarity. She did not look back often. Reflection held little appeal. What mattered was not the path taken, but whether it still held. Systems she had helped shape continued to function without her presence. Training programs operated according to standards she had insisted upon. Institutions measured outcomes more carefully than they once had. These changes were incomplete, uneven, and vulnerable to neglect. They existed nonetheless. For Florence, this was sufficient evidence of progress. The image that survived her moved independently now. The lamp, once a practical object, had become fixed in memory. It glowed steadily in stories simplified for comfort. Florence understood this transformation without resentment. Symbols endure because they are easy to carry. Methods require effort. She had never confused the two. If the symbol encouraged care to be remembered at all, it had served a purpose. What concerned her more was whether memory would preserve responsibility or dissolve it. She knew how easily improvement could be reinterpreted as inevitability. Once suffering declined, its causes were forgotten. Once reform became routine, its necessity faded. Florence guarded against this erosion quietly, through continued emphasis on documentation and evaluation. Even late in life, she insisted that standards be written, not assumed. Her correspondence during these years reflects a tone both precise and patient. She no longer pressed urgently for change. She clarified principles. She reminded institutions of commitments already made. She understood that the final test of reform was not introduction, but maintenance. This was slower work, less visible, and more vulnerable to fatigue. Florence accepted that vulnerability as part of reality rather than a failure. As time passed, she became increasingly aware that her own role would soon recede entirely. She did not attempt to preserve it. Legacy, she believed, distracted from continuity. If systems required her name to function, they were fragile. If they endured without reference to her, they had achieved independence. Florence preferred independence. The world beyond her rooms changed gradually. Medicine advanced, technology shifted, new crises emerged. Florence did not attempt to keep pace with every development. She focused instead on principles that outlived circumstance. Clean environments reduced harm. Clear responsibility prevented neglect. Measurement revealed patterns that sentiment obscured. These truths did not depend on era. They remained applicable wherever care existed. She also understood what her work had not achieved. Inequality persisted. Resources remained unevenly distributed. Institutions still failed under pressure. Florence did not interpret these shortcomings as refutation. Reform, she believed, was not a cure. It was a practice, one that required renewal with each generation. Expecting permanence was a form of complacency. In this acceptance, there was no bitterness. Florence did not imagine that she had fixed the world. She had altered it slightly, deliberately, and at cost. That was enough. Change measured in lives reduced, in suffering shortened, did not require grandeur. It required honesty. When Florence Nightingale died, the response followed familiar patterns. Tributes emphasized devotion. Memorials highlighted character. The lamp appeared again, steady and reassuring. Florence had no influence over this framing. She no longer needed to. What mattered had already moved beyond her. Burial arrangements were simple. There was no attempt to match memory with spectacle. This simplicity reflected her understanding of work done. The labor had never been about presence. It had been about effect. Death did not alter that equation. What remained after her passing was not a single institution or doctrine, but a way of seeing. An insistence that suffering should be examined rather than accepted, that systems deserved scrutiny, that care, when treated seriously, could be organized rather than improvised. These ideas continued quietly, embedded in practice rather than proclamation. Hospitals built routines without remembering their origin. Nurses followed standards without knowing whose hand had shaped them. Administrators measured outcomes because measurement had become expected. Florence would have considered this the highest compliment. Work that disappeared into normalcy had succeeded. The night returned to its usual quiet, the kind that follows completion rather than ignorance. Darkness remained, but it no longer concealed everything. Some structures held, others weakened. The work of maintenance passed to those who followed, often without ceremony. Florence Nightingale had never believed that care required constant illumination. Light, she knew, could be exhausting. What mattered was that once something had been seen clearly, it could not easily be unseen. The lamp had done its work. It could be set down. History often prefers its endings resolved. Florence's story resists this preference. There is no final victory, only continuity shaped by vigilance. The system she influenced would fail again, improve again, and fail again. This cycle did not trouble her. She had never mistaken reform for permanence. What she offered instead was a refusal to accept neglect as natural, refusal to confuse tradition with necessity, refusal to let comfort excuse indifference. These refusals remained embedded in practice long after her name receded from memory. In the end, Florence Nightingale did not leave behind a world transformed. She left behind a world slightly less willing to look away, slightly more prepared to ask why, slightly more capable of seeing patterns where chaos once seemed inevitable. The lamp no longer moved through corridors. The fire had long since burned itself out. What remained was quieter and harder to describe, a set of expectations, a habit of measurement, a discomfort with unexplained suffering. And in that quiet, long after the story ended, the work continued, not because anyone remembered who began it, but because once order had been glimpsed, returning fully to darkness no longer felt acceptable.